So let's talk mainstream global urbanism in more detail. As I said at the outset, it's a position that the United Nations and Habitat and its other urban branches and agencies embrace, but it goes way beyond the UN. So I want to say something about this in historical and geopolitical context. So some points I made last time about mainstream approaches to urban change, I want to repeat. There's some general assumptions in kind of mainstream global urban discourse that have been embraced for a good part of the 20th century, certainly for the second half of the 20th century into the present day. The idea number one, again, this is repeating terrain we covered before, but it needs to be brought back into relief today. The idea of a linear transition model, a universal shift of society from rural or agrarian to urban. That's widely embraced as just common sense discourse. And the idea, furthermore, that the growth and expansion of cities, both the size of cities and the number of cities, and the size of the urban population, as basically an indicator of modernization and industrialization. So the equation of cities with modernity and cities and modernity, furthermore, with industrialization. Those are widespread assumptions, whether as characterizations of what is currently happening, or in some ways more problematically, as we'll see shortly, as goals that we want to achieve. In other words, that if you're trying to promote industrialization, which we can debate about what that might mean and whether that's a worthy goal and for whom, but the widespread assumption that in order to promote industrialization, you've got to basically build big cities, pack people into the cities and turn them into waged workers. So closely related to this is the vision of urbanization as primarily demographic, and that basically that there's a connection historically and in the present period between the expansion of population and the urbanization of that population. Or to put it the other way around, urbanization basically viewed as a shift of the total population from rural to city settlement space. And then furthermore, connected to both of the latter, often, not always, but often connected to both of the previous assumptions, the idea that technological change is ultimately the driver of urbanization. So it may be expressed in demographic terms, in terms of where people live, whether they live in the countryside or in cities, but in this framework, the notion is that the transformation of technologies, of production, of transportation, of consumption, is ultimately what drives urbanization. And that the technologies are expressed in new spatial arrangements, specifically, not only in cities, but specifically within cities. So that the expansion of cities, the growth, the acceleration, intensification of urbanization is viewed as kind of an inevitable outcome of technological change. Like the more we develop technology, the more, so it is argued, will people mass together within big cities. So urbanization viewed as kind of a demographic necessity by consequence of a long-term technological transformation of human life. It's kind of an important aspect of mainstream global urbanism. So these are broad generalizations, but they apply to a lot of different positions, which are embraced by a lot of important institutions, governments around the world. After the 1980s, this particular model that I just summarized gets articulated to a couple of other elements that are very prominent today in contemporary global urban discourse. The view of urbanization as a necessary basis for economic growth and prosperity. And this is widely embraced, as I think you saw in some of the readings, by the United Nations, by the World Bank, and by many national governments. So urbanization, very important for our work here, not simply as a sociological or theoretical concept through which to analyze processes of transformation and struggle in the world, but as an almost normative concept, which governments and other international agencies are using to describe the goal of what their policies are trying to achieve. So urbanization as a goal, as a project through which to promote economic growth, not just economic development, whatever that might mean, but economic growth, constant expansion of GDP, and prosperity. And this is frequently coupled in mainstream global urban discourse to what we might think of as a neoliberal understanding of urbanization. In other words, that the drivers of these processes are basically corporations whose private investments, enabled by market-friendly state policies, will produce the desired growth. And in theory, indeed, only in theory, I would argue, and many of our authors would argue as well, that would then in turn lead to jobs and rising standards of living. So again, the key point here is that it's not just a model of urbanization as a motive, as a process that we need to analyze, but urbanization as a goal, as a project being pursued by national governments around the world, especially in what we now call the Global South, also in China, of course, as Fulong Wu argues, which is driven by corporations investing in industries and infrastructures within big cities, facilitated directly by market-friendly state policies. Again, that also applies to China, as Fulong Wu argues, in order to produce growth. And in more recent years, again, the UN plays a very important role here with its endorsement some years ago in the Quito Habitat Conference, the Sustainable Development Goals. These kinds of neoliberal, market-oriented, market-friendly discourses about global urbanization are now being melded together with the claim that cities and urbanization are the basis for sustainable development and ecological survival in the face of climate change and environmental emergencies. We're going to drill in more detail into that particular claim, not this Thursday, but next Thursday in our last class. This kind of notion, this kind of proposition that cities are going to save the planet because of their ecological, their potential to be ecologically sustainable units of human life. But I just want to signal for, at this stage of today's lecture, that this more market-oriented, economic growth-oriented understanding of global urbanization that began to get consolidated in the 1980s and into the early 21st century is now being articulated to this ecological and sustainability-oriented approach, which, let me just emphasize, and again, we'll come back to it in a couple lectures, it doesn't substantially, on my reading, interrupt the neoliberal framing of urbanization as basically corporate-driven, oriented towards private profit-making, and oriented towards economic growth. And if you believe, as I do, and I'll argue this in more detail next Thursday, if you believe that there's a direct contradiction, a mutual incompatibility between an economy that's based on endless growth and any reasonable concept of ecological sustainability, then you will raise a skeptical eyebrow or two about that particular melding together of neoliberal corporate discourse with the discourse of ecological sustainability. In other words, you can't have it both ways, friends. If you want endless economic growth, you can't have ecological sustainability. If you want ecological sustainability, many would argue, the degrowth theorists would argue, you can't have an economy that's based on constant, compound, expanded economic growth. So I'm just parking that for now. I got to flag it just because it's relevant to today's lecture, but I'm going to come back to it, I promise, a week from Thursday in detail. For the moment, the point is simply to characterize mainstream global urban discourse, building upon this earlier linear transition model from the rural to the urban, melded together in the early 21st century with neoliberal corporate visions of kind of capitalist expansion led by corporations supported by states, and also now melded together with sustainable development, the Sustainable Development Goals, which again, we'll talk more about that and the ways in which they can be co-opted by neoliberal capital or maybe not. But that's a topic to return to shortly. So let's drill into the United Nations a little bit. So if you look at the United Nations World Urbanization Prospects, of which there are now many, many volumes because it's been published for a while. I had you read excerpts from the 2018 one. I asked you to skim it and sort of spend a little time with it. But if you look at the 2018 version, and then you look at like the 2007 version or the 2003 version, or I think there's a 1998 version, you will see, alas, that some of the basic conceptual and cartographic frameworks haven't changed very much. And even though they update the data, and I don't mean to disrespect our colleagues at the UN who are doing important work in all kinds of ways, but I'm just saying, they've updated the data tables, but they tend to use the same framework. It's a little bit like, they get the Microsoft Word file or whatever program they're using, and someone's like, okay, we got to update the data, and then they create a new graphic design. But it's a little bit like the skeleton. They're still using the same skeleton. So the definition of urbanization, which I'm about to read some parts of it, you'll find pretty similar ones from 20 years ago. And even earlier than that, it's not in the World Urbanization Prospects, but in some of the other publications of UN Habitat, in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the UN DISA, some of the same definitions have been used without being updated. So they tell us urbanization is a complex socioeconomic process that transforms the built environment, converting formerly rural into urban settlements, while also shifting the spatial distribution of a population from rural to urban areas. Sounds familiar, right? Like we've been hearing versions of that for quite a while. It includes changes in, and then they give us a lot of different things, occupations, lifestyle, culture, and behavior, and alters the demographic and social structure of both urban and rural areas. Sounds like they've been reading a little Lewis Worth, which, not a bad person to read, but it's pretty familiar from 1934 or 1937, I think, when Worth wrote his essay. And then they continue. I'll skip to the last paragraph. The degree or level of urbanization is typically expressed, pay close attention, as the percentage of population residing in urban areas, defined according to criteria used by national governments for distinguishing between urban and rural areas. So they've done two things here. Urbanization is a proportion, the number of people living within urban areas or cities relative to the rural. And they've also told us that, well, we don't have a universal criterion for that, because every national government in the UN has the right and responsibility to come up with its own criteria. So hold on to that, because we'll see that this is actually very significant. In practice, urbanization refers both to the increase in the percentage of population residing in urban areas and to the associated growth in the number of urban dwellers and in the size of cities and the total area occupied by urban settlements. So that's reasonable. They're telling us that it's the total proportion, it's the proportion within each national territory that lives within cities, but they're also telling us on the ground, cities are multiplying, so there may be more cities, and the size of those cities spatially may also be expanding. So if you have a city-focused understanding of urbanization, those are reasonable propositions. So you then will find, I just chose this one almost at random from the report, but these kinds of diagrams are literally a dime a dozen in these UN reports. In every single world urbanization reports, and I'm going to show you a few earlier diagrams from earlier ones in a moment, you will see diagrams that basically have lots of lines that pretty much look like this. If you look at me for a second instead of the screen, a linear, just like, urbanization is expanding. It starts to look really inevitable. I'll move my cursor around here. Look, it's going up in Africa. It's going up in Asia. It's going up in Europe. It's going up in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's going up in North America. And in Oceania, it's stagnating, but it's still kind of an upward linear trend. So it's this model of like, well, worldwide, we're all going in this kind of same direction because more and more people are moving from the putative countryside to the putative city. It seems like, obvious, just fact. What else could you possibly have in mind? So that, when, you go to conferences on urban planning, cities, urban social science, and important people show diagrams like this and everyone's in the room is just like, yep, you see the heads bobbing. It's so widely taken for granted that lots of important questions don't get posed, which is precisely why we're here, in order to pose some of those questions. So this is what my colleagues, Eric Sheppard, Helga Leitner, and Anant Maringanti argued some years ago, just situating what they call mainstream global urbanism. I didn't ask you to read this article of theirs, but this kind of captures one of their core arguments. So I'm just going to read it out. They say mainstream global urbanism is not a coherent body of theory or practice, but loose bundles of ideas and practices that travel across the world, increasingly through transnational networks. In its mainstream form, it's a way of thinking about urbanism that explicitly or implicitly relies on cities in North America and Western Europe as the norm. So already they're posing some questions. Where does all this come from? Sheppard, Leitner, Maringanti are saying, well, it's actually based on a Euro-American epistemology that they're projecting globally. It bears the imprint of previous rounds of domination and capital accumulation, when European colonial authorities sought to remake Asian, African, and Latin American cities along the lines of emergent principles of European urban planning. So it's not just a neutral depiction, they say, it's tied in with centuries of imperial power in which a certain model of urban development was attempted to be imposed upon colonized parts of the world by the Euro-American colonizers. And so they continue. After colonialism, the goal has been to remake them, these cities outside of Euro-America, into prosperous centers of global capitalism. Most recently, according to the neoliberal precept that capitalist market mechanisms, combined with private property and now good governance, are the key to prosperity. So in a certain way, they're saying it's a new imperialism under the rubric of neoliberalism, projecting this model through the model of kind of free market capitalism instead of through direct imperial domination. Megacities in particular are advised and incentivized to become shiny, modern global cities, like New York, London, Tokyo, or most recently, Singapore, Hong Kong, or Shanghai, presented as Asian exemplars of the global city norm. Self-conscious practitioners of global urbanism are aware that their best practices and policy principles are always localized, subverted, and transmogrified to suit sectarian interests in local contexts, and advocate such localization as desirable. Yet, localization as the global norm is also a representational strategy that maintains the hegemony of the master narrative. So look, this is a powerhouse quote. This is a powerhouse because they're exploding everything that we just read about briefly in the UN. I mean, they're basically now revealing what we just read and is presented to us in the UN's document as sort of neutral, authoritative depiction of what's going on in the world as basically a project that's really quite localized based on a very specific imperial framework of knowledge, and is projecting that model globally as part of a project of capitalist transformation worldwide. And so it becomes, it sort of starts to open up the question about the politics of the UN's and other, global organizations and national governments' understanding of what's going on, and reveals the ways in which urbanization is, again, not just a neutral analytic category, but a political project. So I want to unpack this kind of way of thinking about things that Leitner, Sheppard, and Maringanti open up in more detail, basically in the rest of the lecture. So let me just take a step back